I got off to scratch off the list.
Okay.
Yeah, for the last 7 years. Absolutely.
Good morning, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank y'all for making it out. If you did not know, I'm sure some of you do know though, we have a baseball exhibit going on next door. And this lecture is sort of in conjunction with that, and we thought it would be appropriate to invite Mr. Torres to come out here and talk to y'all today. He will be coming back next month. There's some flyers for that up here in the front. And if there are any questions throughout the presentation, just let me know. I'll be right in the back.
And you are?
Miss Marianne Modestad.
Okay.
Yes,
And-
I am the program coordinator here at the museum.
Okay.
And without further ado, let's welcome Mr. Noe Torres.
Thank you.
I think it's been about 10 years since I last spoke here, so I'm very happy to be back. It's been a while, and I always enjoy coming here because I grew up actually in downtown Mission, even though we lived on the outskirts of town, not in the Mission city limits. We lived on North Sherry Road, but Mission was like our adopted place where my parents would come to shop, and my uncle worked at Lax, which is right here in downtown, and I would ride down here with him when I was a little kid and go to the public library, which was a little building over off to the side. I've forgotten exactly where it was now. Steve and I were driving around trying to find it earlier, but things have changed a little bit, but Mission has stayed a lot the same. Now I live in Edinburgh and I work at McAllen High School. I've worked there for 25 years as a librarian. And early in my time at Mac High, I was thinking about all the wonderful stories that my dad used to tell me about the baseball leagues in South Texas. He used to attend the games of the McAllen Palms and all the teams from this area. And that inspired me to write my first book, which is Ghost Leagues, minor league baseball in South Texas. And this was just like my tribute to all the old teams and all the old ball players of the area. And after I wrote this book, I was going around talking about
You have this one.
I was talking about the baseball teams here in the valley and the players, and then everybody kept pointing me to one particular player that was very well known and very famous, and I do cover him in my original book. That's Leonardo Alanis, known as Leo Najo professionally. But I was getting so much requests from people who had known him and who had played with him, and my dad also had known him, that I ended up writing a book that I collaborated with his family, his granddaughter Atit Farias and other members of his family that helped me put this book together, which is basically the first biography that's ever been written about Leo Najo. So that is just to give you a little bit of background of how I came into it. I've always been a baseball fan, and I had this connection through my dad with all the old teams in the valley. So I want to take you back in time to before there was, this weekend is the start of the NFL season, and everybody's so excited. But I'm going to take you back in time to before there was an NFL, before there was an NBA. When the only sport that people cared about in the United States and in many parts of North America was baseball. Baseball was the king of sports, and in many of our minds it still is, but nowadays it shares attention with all these other things that people are interested in. But in those days, around the turn of the last century, around the 1900s, the teens, the 20s, the 30s, baseball was it. I mean, love it or leave it. Baseball was the spectator sport that dominated American media, attention, people's attention. You see people in the old newsreels, and they're sitting in their Sunday best with their jackets on and sitting at the baseball game watching the players. So this was I'm just going to briefly go over to give you an idea of where the South Texas leagues fall into the history of baseball. So they say, the historians tell us that baseball developed around the 1840s in the area of New Jersey. And that's when it started, people started playing the game and the rules started evolving. And professional baseball then finally became more organized, and it was starting to be played in most large cities around the United States by around 1870. So keep in your mind that date, 1870. We're going to find out in a few minutes how it came to the Rio Grande Valley and how baseball started being played down here. The National League, what we know of as the National League today, was established in New York in 1876. Now, baseball in Texas has been around for a really long time. It wasn't long after the establishment of professional baseball and the National League that baseball came to Texas. Around 1880, the Texas League started. And we know the Texas League exists even today, although it's in a much different, it has evolved a lot over the years. But, so that's how Texas, baseball came to Texas. Now, this is another interesting fact that was brought to my attention recently by a friend of mine, Noe Torres, who's a baseball historian in Brownsville. And he's done a lot of good research into South Texas history of baseball. And let me see if we can get the slide back here in a minute. But basically...
Sorry, has it been doing that?
It hasn't really been doing it
started.
that much. It just started right now. Okay, so there was a soldier named Abner Doubleday who, when he was serving in the U.S. Army under Zachary Taylor during the U.S.-Mexico War, was stationed in Brownsville. And now some people say that Abner Doubleday was the one who invented the game of baseball, although there's a lot of doubt among historians as to whether that's true or not. But Rene has done a lot of research into Abner Doubleday's time in Brownsville. He was in Brownsville in 1846 and again in 1848. Now we're going to bring you forward in time just a little bit. In 1900, the American League was established, which we know now that both the Houston Astros and the Texas Rangers are in the American League, although the Astros used to be in the National League. In 1901, the minor leagues were organized. And from 1900 to 1910, that's when South Texas and the Rio Grande Valley began to experience this explosion of interest in the game of baseball. And it began with soldiers who were stationed along the Texas-Mexico border, and they brought the game with them back from the East Coast. Many of them were from the East Coast, and they brought the love of the game of baseball here to the Rio Grande Valley, and it started to spread mainly among the troops, but then eventually among the people of South Texas. Now, when I did a lot of research for my books at the local, in the local archives, and at the Museum of South Texas History, I found this very interesting picture of a very early baseball team. Let me see if we can get the picture stable in a minute. But it's a very early baseball team. It's titled the Texas Champions in 1916. Let's see if we can get that back here in a minute.
Let me try exiting the slideshow view
Okay.
and see maybe if it works on a general view.
That's funny. Before we started the presentation, it seemed to be really working well. I also have my own laptop if we have to switch out.
I'm going to change the HDMI real quick.
Okay.
It might be the HDMI.
So anyway, this caption that I looked through a bunch of old baseball team pictures from the turn of the last century at the Museum of South Texas History, and this one really caught my eye. It says baseball team with 23rd Infantry, and once again the year was 1916. Just a little mention about my dad. I talked to him about him earlier. He was born in 1908, and he was present when baseball was exploding in South Texas. He was an amateur left-handed pitcher in the 1920s. He never made any of the organized teams, but he was a big baseball fan, and he used to travel and visit all the games that were going on here in South Texas. It seems to me much better. We can see if it's remains steady. So he used to tell me about going to see major league players here in the Rio Grande Valley. That they came down here for spring training, and of course that was much later in his life, and he didn't recall the exact year. But when I did the research, and I'm going to talk about it in my later slides, there was spring training that was held here in the Rio Grande Valley in 1920, and I want to talk about that. Then he also told me about going to see the games of the McAllen Palms, and later the Rio Grande Valley Giants and other local teams. And of course the famous Mission 3030s, they were his favorite team, and he used to go and watch them play. And he had a chance to meet Leonardo Alanis, who is known as Leo Najo. Okay, so just to go back and repeat a little bit about what I said earlier is television did not exist in those days, and there were no other sports: football, NFL, basketball, nothing. Everything had to revolve around baseball. Movies and radio were still just barely coming into the public attention. There were few entertainment options. There were no internet. You know, now I've been working at the high school level a long time, and I see kids just totally enthralled with their phones. Like they're just sitting there watching TikTok videos all day long when they're not in class. But in those days, there was nothing to consume the public's attention. The whole attention of the United States public that were interested in sports was on the game of baseball. So it was a tremendous recreational outlet also for families. Heck, I remember when I was a little kid, we used to go to Ansel Lewis Park, and when everybody would be playing baseball, including my dad and myself and my brothers. So baseball was the game. So it was a source of pride also. It was a source of pride for the communities. I'm going to share with you as we go along that there were almost every team in the valley had at one point or another a team, a baseball team, an organized baseball team. Sometimes they were part of the minor league system, and other times they were not. They were considered semi-pro. But either way, the communities had teams, and they were very excited to have a team, and it brought community pride, and it made everybody happy. Here's a 1920 poster that appeared in the Brownsville, Texas newspaper to announce a major league exhibition game. Now that was a really big thing back there. It demonstrates how important the game was to the people of that time. Philadelphia Athletics, St. Louis Cardinals, game called at 3:30. Business houses will close from 2 p.m. to 5 to permit employees to attend the game. Wouldn't that be nice? I mean, sometimes Pikey, sometimes Bulldogs are playing in there at McConn. They won't even let us employees
Yeah.
during our break go out there.
No, education more important.
So anyway, back then they used to close the businesses. As I mentioned, the Texas League started in the 1880s, and San Antonio and Houston were the inaugural members of the Texas League. But here, the Rio Grande Valley was considered too wild and rugged for a team, a minor league baseball team, to be put down here until the year 1910. So there was this, like roughly 20-year period when minor league was hitting big upstate, but not in the valley, because we were, there were banditos conducting raids across the border, and there was instability, and they said, nah, too remote and too lawless. And then all of this changed when the railroads came down to the Rio Grande Valley and opened up railways, and travel by train became the lifeline of the baseball teams which started coming down and playing. So 1904 was when the coming of the railroads, and then American troops were stationed in this area, and they brought law and order to the towns along the Texas border. And then these two gentlemen, Junie Covellini and Sam Bell, in 1908, had an amateur, they started an amateur baseball team in Brownsville called the Brownsville Brownies. And they eventually in 1910, after a couple of years of play as amateur, semi-pro, they became the Rio Grande Valley's first affiliated minor league baseball team. So this is a photograph of the two gentlemen who started this ball club, the Brownsville Brownies, which began as the first minor league team in 1910. So they were part of a circuit or a league which was known as the Southwest Texas League. It was Class D minor leagues in 1910, and it included only one team from the Valley, the Brownsville team, but it included Victoria Rosebuds, Beeville Orange Growers, Bay City Rice Eaters, and the Laredo Bermudas and the Corpus Christi Pelicans. Very appropriate name for Corpus Christi. So I always like to see the names that they gave these old teams because they're very, very funny, and they go along with the area in which the teams were based. So the Brownies became the Rio Grande Valley's first official minor league baseball team, and Sam Bell, one of the two founders, became the manager of the team. Here's a picture right here after they won the Southwest Texas League Championship after the season. So you see them there. And this is an article, and I apologize, kind of blurry because it's from a long time ago, of course. But here's an article from the Brownsville Daily Herald, April 21st, 1910, in which the Brownies won the championship in the 10th inning, and they became, I'm sorry, this was not when they won the championship, this is when the very first game that was played, Wednesday, April 20th, 1910, between the Brownies and the Corpus Christi Pelicans. And I included a little ad that appeared on this page right here for a Maxwell Model G Red Roadster, which you could buy from a dealer in Brownsville.
Were there any Hispanics on that team?
There were no Hispanics
They were all white, but
that
they were
we
called
can see.
Brownies.
There were Brownies, but there were no Browns.
But who's the Brownsville Browns, I guess? Brownsville.
Just because it, yeah, from
They
Brownsville.
Because it rhymed, right? Oh, but the Latino players were coming, and they were coming in full force. There's no worry about that. Now, this was the one that I thought I had just put up. This is when they won the actual championship. The Brownies beat the Rosebuds, and they won the championship of the Southwest Texas League with a 42-17 record. So they beat Victoria, and the article right here on the right side of the screen says the Victoria pitchers were kind of wild, and so Brownsville was able to capture the victory. It's very interesting to look at these old newspapers and see the ads and see the news stories of that day. So I really enjoyed going. It's like going back in time. It's like doing time travel. So this article, or this victory by the Brownsville team, the first championship ever in any sport at a professional level in Rio Grande Valley, happened in August 23rd, 1910. So then baseball became a thing after that, and there was another league in 1911, also the Brownsville Brownies, most of the same teams, in fact all the same teams. Don't remember if Beeville was in the previous league, but anyway, the Beeville Orange Growers. And so the league continued, but unfortunately, what we're going to see a pattern of in all of these early leagues is financial difficulties. you got to understand that there was no night baseball at this time. They didn't have lights at the ballparks. Only people who could attend during the day, like if your business allowed you to go and see the game, then you would go, because otherwise you couldn't go. And there was no television, there was no radio broadcast, and there was no lights for nighttime baseball. So attendance suffered, of course, and these leagues tended to fold after a year or two. They tended to go bankrupt. Financial problems forced both Victoria and Corpus Christi to quit the Southwest Texas League in 1911. That's 1 year after Brownsville won the championship. And the league finished with only 4 teams. Brownsville had a 64-52 record, and they won second place in the second year of play in the Southwest Texas League. And then there was one famous, notable manager who was the manager of Beeville. His name was William J. Dish. And he became one of the all-time winningest college baseball managers ever for the Texas Longhorns. And in fact, if you go to Austin to see a Texas Longhorns game, the field where they play is Dish Field. Dish Falk. It's named after 2 different former coaches of the team. So he was the manager of the Beeville team. Now, 1920, I alluded to when I started. My dad remembered seeing all of these major leaguers come to the Valley and play all along what is now Expressway 83, or, you know, what do they call it now?
Miracle Run?
Anyway, all along Expressway 83 from Brownsville all the way to McAllen. At every little town along the way, they'd have games just out in a field, in an improvised baseball field. So, who came down here? Branch Rickey, manager of the 1920 St. Louis Cardinals. He became one of the most legendary figures in American Major League Baseball later on, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about him later. Also came to the Valley was Roger Hornsby, who was a star player for the Cardinals in 1920. The St. Louis Cardinals and the Philadelphia A's were the only 2 teams to ever hold Major League Baseball training in the Valley, in the Rio Grande Valley, spring training. And that was in 1920. And they brought their teams to the Valley for a series of 10 exhibition games. And we know of Branch Rickey because he became very famous for being the one that finally broke the color barrier. He was the one that made it possible for Jackie Robinson to join his team in the 1940s. Jackie Robinson made his major league debut in 1947, and so he was one of the great pioneers for the Cardinals and later Browns, Cardinals, Dodgers, and Pirates. So he brought Jackie Robinson to Brooklyn in 1947. Now what's really interesting is that although Jackie Robinson is recognized as the one who broke the color barrier, in my book, Leo Najo, the interesting fact is that Leo Najo was drafted by the Chicago White Sox in 1925, which was long before Jackie Robinson. So I'll be talking more about that. So a little bit more about when Major League Baseball came to the Rio Grande Valley. This is an article from the Sporting News, 1919. And it says, about the only honest-to-goodness bit of baseball news handed out locally last week was that Branch Rickey had picked Brownsville, Texas, as a spring training camp for the Cardinals. According to our geography, Brownsville is a couple of acres and a hop, step, and a jump nearer the equator than even Miami, Florida. More than that, Brownsville is almost out of the country, for it's just across the line from Mexico. Rickey talked of taking his Cardinals to Brownsville once before, but at that time the town was being shot up daily by Mexican revolutionists, and the trip was called off. Now that Mexico is mostly at peace, and we can probably say that now, In spite of a lot of land and oil grabbers to make it appear otherwise for their own purposes, Brownsville is safe, so Ricky picks it. And this was 1919, right? How things have changed. Now we worry about the drug cartels and the illegal immigration and stuff like that. So the city of Brownsville and the entire Rio Grande Valley really rolled out the red carpet for the major league teams, Philadelphia and St. Louis. These were some of the top level players and personalities in the game of baseball. And so there were exhibition contests. These are some articles here. Branch Rickey's Cardinals to play several games along the border. First game today at the local ballpark. Everybody just embraced the major league players. Here, manager Branch Rickey of the Cardinals and H.B. Galbraith, president of the Brownsville Baseball Association, were guests today of the San Benito Rotary Club. I mean, this was major. This was big. And this was the so-called Highway 83 series, and my dad remembers seeing many of these games. The Cardinals and the Athletics basically were playing each other in a series of exhibition games all along the various towns. So they ended up in Brownsville, but they went from Mercedes to Pharr to San Benito to Donna, then back to Brownsville, back to San Benito. 2 games in McAllen, back to Brownsville, which was their home base, so it's logical. And it's interesting the comments of the reporters at that time. The teams rode on trains and often played on less than ideal playing surfaces. But South Texas residents enthusiastically supported the games. I read other descriptions where they just played in an empty lot, didn't even have grass on it. It just had rocks. And they had to be really careful. They just kind of marked it off for the diamond. But anyway, it was a big thing for the Valley at that time.
What year was that?
1920. 1920. So that was the Cardinals, and so after that, baseball interest continued to grow. Of course, people have been exposed to major league talent down here. Now they wanted more baseball. And there was a lot of amateur and semi-pro teams down here. But we didn't have another minor league team until 1926, when there were two teams that started somewhere else but ended up in the Valley. We had the Edinburgh Bobcats, which originally were in Victoria, and then we had the Mission Grapefruiters, a very appropriate name. The Mission Grapefruiters in 1926, which started the season in Kingsville, but then due to financial problems, in other words, there weren't anybody showing up for the games, then they moved them to Mission. So the Edinburgh Bobcats semi-pro team, they existed before they became a minor league team, and they existed after they became a minor league team. But in 1926, they became an official, affiliated with the majors minor league team called of course, they kept their name, Edinburgh Bobcats. They joined the minors in 1926, and this was a picture of some of the team members that I found at the Museum of South Texas History. So you see them hanging out in the dugout. And I want to talk a little bit about that season of 1926. Laredo finished on top, but when they refused to play in the 10th game of the League Championship Series, the Edinburgh Bobcats were declared the winners by default. So Edinburgh actually ended up in the championship of that 1926 Gulf Coast League. This was Edinburgh's only professional sports championship until 2001, when the Edinburgh Roadrunners won a title in the independent league, Texas-Louisiana League. So, very interesting. 1926, keep that in mind. 1927, the league tried again under a new name, the Texas Valley League. And it consisted of the Edinburgh Bobcats again. The Mission Grapefruiters came back for another go. Corpus Christi was always had a strong baseball presence, and now we added the Laredo Oilers. So this Corpus Christi won the 1927 championship by defeating Laredo, and it was Corpus Christi's first professional sports title, although there were many more to come. Corpus Christi was always big after this in baseball, and they continue today with the Corpus Christi Hooks AA team in the affiliated with the Houston Astros. So this was the big headline for Corpus Christi's first professional sports championship in 1922. They defeated the Oilers 4-0 to win the Valley League pennant. And then unfortunately we all know what happened in the late 20s. We had the Depression. We had a lot of economic distress throughout the country. Baseball and other recreational activities had to take a back seat. This was a time of economic collapse, and it affected everything. So it was a couple of years before anyone even attempted to bring baseball back to the Valley, and that attempt was the Rio Grande Valley League in 1931. It featured a team which started in Corpus but ended up in La Feria of all things. La Feria Nighthawks. It was La Feria's first baseball team, minor league team. And then you had the Harlingen Lads. Now, after this, Harlingen became a big player in the baseball teams in South Texas. And Harlingen continued to have teams all through the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. They became a big player. But the Harlingen team, the San Benito Saints, and the McAllen Palms. This was the introduction of the first McAllen team, which came on down through the years, even right down to the 40s and 50s. So this newspaper article here that you see says the Rio Grande Valley, a new Class D circuit in Texas, made its debut in the ranks of organized baseball this week. 4 clubs made up the league, and as all are within easy riding distance of each other, the schedule provided opening games for each of them the first week. So the schedule for that first week was Harlingen at Corpus, McAllen at San Benito. Corpus at Harlingen was the continuation of the series, and then San Benito at McAllen. So they turned around and played at each other's home parks. And this was covered by the Sporting News, which was the preeminent publication about sports in the United States. So if there's any doubt that baseball was big at this time, that was it. Night baseball, finally. We know that when night baseball happened, suddenly baseball exploded because people could go after their shift, their work schedule ended. I mean, you could go and see the games in the evening. It was, especially on the weekend or whatever. So in May 1931, Harlingen became the first baseball field in the Valley to receive lights, arc lights. How amazing. It turned nighttime into daytime. And, the baseball teams weren't doing it to accommodate their fans as much as to accommodate their bottom line, because their attendance wasn't good. And they needed to do something to spark interest in attendance. So after Harlingen brought arc lights, other teams, including McAllen, and what happened in 1931, though, was that the league that was bringing the lights in, they weren't able to get the lights in place until later in the season, and it wasn't enough to save the season, unfortunately. And it still didn't work out. When the first half of the season ended in July 1931, the McAllen Palms were in first place. Although their first place finish was disputed by the La Feria team, which filed a formal protest. On July 29th, just a few weeks later, the league suspended operations due to financial problems. McAllen had the best record in the league, and many people, historians argue that McAllen should be given the championship by default. And this would have been McAllen's first and only professional sports championship. Although it is disputed, okay. But Pikey, I think, as the sports writers would probably just say McAllen, by default.
Yeah.
They had their best record,
Season's over.
and the season ended. So I don't care what La Feria thought about it. I think McAllen had the better record. So here's a newspaper article containing a picture of the whole team. McAllen Palms makes a sensational last half pennant drive. So finally we arrive at the Leo Najo era for South Texas. I mean, he had been playing for teams in Oklahoma, and he had been playing, he was drafted in 1925 by the Chicago White Sox, and he had been around the baseball world, but as far as his, toward his latter part of his career, he came back to South Texas and he was playing and managing teams down here. So Mission's legendary Leo Najo signed to play center field in 1938 for the McAllen Palms. So in this 1938 Palms team photo on the right, all the way on the right, you see Lee Najo, as the picture calls him, Lee Najo, playing center field. And then there's this interesting player. A lot of baseball historians make this mistake. There's a player identified as Ty Cobb standing right beside him in the team picture. That's not the Ty Cobb, who was a famous Major League Baseball player. This was no relation, and he was a minor league baseball player his entire career, and he retired from baseball in 1940s. So he is often misidentified. No, Leo Najo did not play with Ty Cobb. Well, not the Ty Cobb. So the Texas Valley League in 1938, Refugio Oilers, Corpus Christi Spudders. What is a sputter? Does anyone know? Is that
Potato.
a potato farmer, right? Harlingen Hubs, the Charros of Brownsville, the Cardinals of Taft, and the McAllen Palms.
Where's Taft?
Taft is up there near Sinton Taft, near Corpus. Yeah. So a little bit about Leo Najo, and I'm going to show you a short video from an excellent documentary that was done. I'm just going to show a brief excerpt about Leo Najo. Leo Najo was born in 1899 in La Lajia, Nuevo León, and he lived in Mission for almost his entire life. 1926, he became one of the first Latinos to be drafted by a major league team, the Chicago White Sox. And he was a member of the 1932 Tulsa Oilers, named one of the top 100 minor league teams of all time. He batted an astonishing .323 in 113 games. In addition to playing in the minor leagues for most of the 1920s and 30s, he also played, coached, and managed for the legendary semi-pro team, the Mission 3030s. Although Leo Najo was 39 years old, and near the end of his playing days when he signed with the McAllen Palms in 1938, he still hit 20 home runs to lead the league. It's an amazing accomplishment. And I'm going to show this excellent, just a few minutes of this excellent documentary that was done by Oscar Hernandez, a friend of mine, about Leo Najo. His documentary is called The Leo Najo Story, and it's available online. You can watch the whole thing for free. This is just a little excerpt here, and I'm going to play.
He was an outstanding athlete.
Did we turn that up?
He was undersized for a ball player, and he made up for it with his skills, both as a base runner and he had exceptional strength as a batter with run power. And like I say, when you're a base stealer, it excites the crowd, and that would drew people out. Something about baseball, home run hitters and base stealers seem to draw the attention of the fans. And this, I guess, attributed to his success on the field and after the field, and people admired him, and then that carried on, for a city like Mission and the Rio Grande Valley to keep recognizing, try to keep his name in the public eye as much as possible and not fade away.
He was born Leonardo Alanis with an S, and later on he didn't like how Alanis looked with an S, so he changed it to a Z himself.
He came to the valley as a 10-year-old. His mother came to Mission, moved to Mission from a small town close to Monterey. Did go to Guadalupe School, a Catholic school in Mission.
His mom owned a very successful bar in Mission, which the building still exists to this day. But he had the ability, because of his mom having some amount of wealth built up through her bar and some real estate. He had the ability to spend a lot of time practicing and playing baseball.
So he started playing semi-pro ball, and then he got into professional organized baseball. Because semi-pro was organized, but it wasn't professional. It was semi-professional. The players weren't paid salaries. But then he got picked up by the San Antonio.
When he was first called to San Antonio to try out for the San Antonio Bears, the owner of the Bears at that time was very much against Latinos. And he had heard all these wonderful stories of how good Najo was, and he needed a good ball player. But he resented the fact that Najo was a Latino, and the first time Najo tried out for the San Antonio Bears, he did outstanding. Anybody that did not have a problem with race would have snapped him up in a moment. But San Antonio Bears passed up on him. They decided not to hire him. However, he went back to South Texas and continued to have a stellar career, and they called him again for another tryout a year later. And he just did so well that there was no way they could pass him this time. So they signed him the second time in 1924, and he played for the San Antonio Bears in 1925. But that owner was so anti-Latino that he limited how many times Najo would play in the games, and he ended up shipping him off to a Class B team the following year. Despite the fact that he had done tremendously in San Antonio, the fans loved him. So it was unfortunate, at that time everybody was experiencing this discrimination. If you weren't white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant ball player, you were going to have difficulties. And let me see if I can advance to the next slide here in just a second. So it just so happened that it was a time period in which he played. It was amazing that he accomplished as much as he did, and I tell people, because now you turn on the TV any evening and you see hundreds of excellent Latino players from South America, from the Caribbean, from Mexico. But in those days, you didn't see a one. It was extremely rare. You saw no blacks, you saw no Latinos. So it was something, what he accomplished in that time period. He wasn't the only excellent Latino player playing at that time. There were many others. Another player from Mission, Manuel Cortinas, he broke into the minor leagues in 1935 with the Class C West Dixie League. And in 1938, once again, toward the end of his playing career, he played right field for the Corpus Christi Spudders. There's that name again. And he led the Texas Valley League in batting with an amazing 380 average. So, Mission native Manuel Cortinas. Just another example of the excellent Latino ball players of that time period. Okay, another big development in baseball was when the games started to be broadcast. Okay, suddenly if you were not able to go to the game, you could listen to them on the radio. Big development. It's hard for us in this age where we can see and hear everything using the internet. We can watch all the games if we're willing to pay for them. But back then, if you didn't go and be physically present in the stands of that baseball stadium, you didn't see the games. I mean, you had to be there. Well, this all changed in 1938 here in McAllen, when the very first radio broadcast was organized by the McAllen Junior Chamber of Commerce. And it was in partnership with the baseball team in McAllen at that time, the Palms. So the public relations director for the team, J.D. Harris, also announced that a national radio network was interested in broadcasting all McAllen Palms baseball games beginning with the 1939 season. Unfortunately, that did not materialize, but it was so exciting at the time and they were just building it up and promoting it. But there were local broadcasts that began in 1938 and continued through the 40s and 50s. So, there on the article on the right, it says, it talks about the Junior Chamber of Commerce. Down the last paragraph, broadcast of the McAllen or Foot Hill baseball game will be sponsored by the Junior Chamber at 4:15 p.m., which will be followed at 7:30 by a broadcast of the arrival of guests at the hotel. So it became part of a whole evening of Chamber of Commerce activities. So this particular minor league season, Corpus Christi relied on the talents of Manuel Cortinas, Mission native, captured the league title, but then the Spudders, Corpus Christi Spudders, were swept 4-0 in the league championship series by the Harlingen team. You see the Harlingen team down in the lower right-hand corner. And from the Sporting News. So the Harlingen team swept the series against Corpus, and they captured Harlingen's first ever professional sports championship on September 7th, 1938. And once again, looking through the lineup for both teams, do we see any Latinos? Unfortunately not. So, but we did have Latinos on some of the other teams, such as Cortina and
There's a Johnny Guerrero.
there's Cortinas. There's Cortinas. I'm sorry, I had missed that earlier. And you say there's a Guerrero here?
On the picture, I mean,
Okay, he didn't make the lineup, but
I guess not.
he's on the team.
No,
That's funny.
what position did Leo? No.
He was primarily an outfielder,
Outfield.
center field. Mostly Cortinas was right fielder for the most part. So 1939, 1938 was a successful debut. The teams all made it through the year. Harlingen won the championship in 1938. And in 1939, there were plans for the Texas Valley League to come back and have another successful season. But unfortunately, before the season started, this was a very turbulent time in American history. It was the start of the World War II. And so unfortunately what happened is they abandoned the plans to play in 1939. So there was no 1939 season for the Texas Valley League. And what happens next, and I'm going to summarize this just quickly because our time is coming to an end. We have a period of time known as the Golden Age of South Texas baseball. That's 1949, that's after World War II, to 1961. So this was when some of the greatest baseball action happened in South Texas with some of the biggest names who went on to play in the major leagues. And these were the leagues: the Rio Grande Valley League Class D, 1949, the Rio Grande Valley League Class C, moving up one classification in 1950, the Gulf Coast League, another jump in classification, 1951 to 1953, stayed at Class B for the Big State League in 1954 to 57, and finally, the culmination of the highest classification of the minors that the Valley ever had was the Texas League. We had a team in Harlingen, Class AA, they called it at that time, in 1958 to 1961. 3 years, and then after that, there was no more minor league baseball in South Texas. So this was the Golden League. The Rio Grande Valley League was only one season. Corpus Christi, Laredo, Brownsville, McAllen, Del Rio, and Robstown. So Corpus Christi won the league. They led the league in attendance, and they swept the championship series 4-0 over the Brownsville Charros. Corpus Christi was fast becoming the dominant baseball power in South Texas, and they would be during this golden era time period. I'm going to tell you, before we run out of time, the amazing story of the McAllen Palms owner, Andrew J. Paris, who is known as the Bubble Gum King. Paris made his fortune when other U.S. gum manufacturers were suffering through a shortage of latex, which was the primary ingredient for bubble gum at that time, resulting from World War II. So he acquired latex, or he acquired gum, 5,000 tons of gum from Mexico at a very cheap price, and he dumped it into the U.S. market and made a fortune. So much so that it was featured in Life magazine, February 3rd, 1947 edition. So there's actually been a documentary made, and he was the owner of the McAllen Giants. I said the Palms. The Palms became the Giants. So I'm going to show you a little trailer for the documentary about him.
It's all over the face of the world. Bubble gum. And tonight we want you to meet the man responsible, the Bubble Gum King himself, from McAllen, Texas, Andrew J. Paris.
It was not too long after the war, we had all this grim stuff from 1941 to 1945. People were ready for something fun. And there he was. He provided it.
Andy, in other words, you buy your bubble gum in Mexico, or you buy the ingredients for bubble gum in Mexico?
We buy the ingredients, and all our manufacturing is done in Monterey, Mexico City. I was the first to bring it in and give each kid in America enough bubble gum.
Would they call it the millionaire, the youngest millionaire?
$10,000 a day in net profit, what he was bringing in to that business. $10,000 a day in 1947. I mean, if you look at it, what would that be in today's value? It's just astounding. That's what he's bringing in.
I mean, all of the Mexican people loved Andy. He was a perfect ambassador. They loved him. The women loved him. The men, they admired him.
They published his picture in a Life magazine. He's a celebrity. I mean, every available woman was ready to line up to knock on his door. Most of the people I knew liked it. There were some people who did not. You get a lot of that attention. Sometimes it's not all very good. He drew a lot of attention from the IRS.
They were going to go through the records, and he never acknowledged that there was anything wrong. What on earth are they looking for? Do I have something like to hide?
It's the wrong guy, man. It's the wrong guy.
This would never happen today, ever.
You can find the whole film, which was done by his son, John Paris. You can find it on the internet. You can watch it. there is a cost to watch it though, so.
The building still stands in McAllen.
That's right, I was.
It's all over the...
Oops. Okay. So the interesting thing when it comes to baseball, he owned the McAllen team, but he also was going to construct this mega stadium, baseball stadium, at the intersection of what is now Nolana and 10th, the southwest corner. So construction began in late March 1949 on a 15-acre tract, 10th and Nolana. McAllen teams had, up to that point, they had been using an old ballpark, which is called Palms Park on South Main Street. So Paris bought the franchise, paid $18,500 for the land, $16,500 for the grandstands, and $9,000 for the lights and fences, which in 1949 was a lot of money. Construction of Paris Stadium was set to begin. 4 citizens living near the proposed ballpark filed a lawsuit to keep the McAllen Giants from playing there. They said, quote, "The North 10th Street area is an ideal suburban residential section, and noises and floodlights will create a nuisance." So guess what? Even though Paris eventually won and he was given permission to go ahead and do it, he decided to abandon the project. He didn't want to have, I guess, any further legal issues. So on Friday, April 22nd, a jury in the 93rd District Court in Edinburgh heard about 90 minutes of arguments and then deliberated 25 minutes before deciding neither the lights nor the noises from the ballpark will materially interfere with the four plaintiffs in the comfort and enjoyment of their homes. Despite this victory, the team abandoned plans to use the North 10th location and instead fell back to using the old city-owned semi-pro park at South McAllen. So here's a picture of the location where it was going to be, and very ironic what happened to the property. Pikey, do you know what happened to the property? So they had movies showing late into the night. The local residents had, because Paris sold it to a company that put in a movie theater, and they had the North 10th property where residents feared that baseball would be disruptive became the location for a drive-in movie theater that ran 2 movies every night, attracting large numbers of cars and late night activities. So yeah, it didn't work out too well for the neighborhood, but very ironic. Well, Donna finally got their first baseball team, 1949. That was another landmark as we start to wrap things up here. Donna's team did not last very long. Leo Najo, one of his last endeavors in organized baseball, was manager of the 1950 Laredo Apaches. He led the team to a pretty strong record, 3rd place in the standings, but he resigned on May 31st. Moving on quickly, Donna and Weslaco and Robstown all had financial difficulties, let's say, and they also folded their teams. Harlingen won finished atop the league, but then they were defeated by Corpus in the championships. Lots of financial problems began at around that point. Professional football and basketball were coming in, taking more of the nation's entertainment dollars. 1951, you had Brownsville, Corpus, Galveston, Harlingen, Lake Charles, Louisiana, Laredo, Port Arthur, Texas City. Kyle Rote was a player for a little bit with the Corpus Christi team. The Corpus Christi won the championship. 1952. I'm just going to go through this fast because we've run out of time. More financial difficulties in the 50s. And then I'm going to skip on down to Red McComb was one of the owners of the Corpus Christi team in 1954. The Valley team didn't do so well. But I'm going to get over to the Texas League, which was the highlight of baseball in the professional baseball in the Valley. So in 1958, the Texas League had a franchise in Oklahoma City. Steve, you're familiar with Oklahoma City. They have a team nowadays. But in 1960, the Oklahoma City franchise was moved to Harlingen and became the Rio Grande Valley Giants, the highest level of minor league baseball ever to come to the Rio Grande Valley. And they had really good teams there. They had a knuckleball pitcher who became very famous later in the big leagues, Gaylord Perry. He pitched in Harlingen for the Rio Grande Valley Giants in 1960. And this was the league affiliation from 60 to 61. You had the Amarillo team, Austin, San Antonio, Tulsa, Victoria, and you had the Valley Giants, which were based in Harlingen. So it was a big thing for the area. Two other notable players from the Rio Grande Valley Giants were Manny Mota, who went on to a stellar major league career with the Dodgers, and Jose Tartabull, who became a big league player for the Boston Red Sox. So that was, all these years of grinding through little teams in Donna, La Feria, Harlingen, and having struggles to make ends meet. And finally, it all culminated in the early 60s with this AA team, with major players that went on to play in the major leagues. And so the Rio Grande Valley finished 1960 with the best record in the Texas League. And so the Valley team unfortunately lost in the playoffs and they lost 3-0 to Victoria, and that ended their season. But we can always say, they had the best record in the league that year, in the highest level of baseball that ever came to the Valley. So unfortunately, the 1961 season began. We all thought that the Rio Grande Valley Giants were going to have another successful year, but the owner of the team, E.J. Humphreys, decided to move the team from Harlingen to Victoria, citing low attendance and poor community support. So on June 9, 1961, after reaching its highest level of professional baseball, the Rio Grande Valley lost its dream team, and no other affiliated minor league team would call the Valley home, for actually not just the 20th century, but extending into the 21st century. We've had some independent teams, but we have had no more affiliated, major league affiliated minor league teams in the Valley. So that is my presentation. I have available on your way out, if you'd like to, I have 2 books about baseball. I have Ghost Leagues, which is an overview of everything I talked about today. And then I have Leo Najo, which is specifically about him and his career. I have those available here if anybody's interested.